Hello dear friends. In this session we are going to understand the use of use context hook in React. So we also discuss what is the context and how to use a context for accessing data generated by one component into another component. So what is use context? Use context is a hook that allows to access data produced by one component into another component without passing data from one component to another component. So whenever the component needs send data that is processed by one component in another component, we have to pass those data with the help of props. But without using props, we can use the use context hook that allows us to access the data that is generated or produced by one component into another component or any number of components that is available in your application. If one component is having some data and the other component want that data can be accessed with the help of this use context hook. So the hook allows us to provide some of the useful features. One of the most important feature is passing uh, uh, passing data from one component to another. Second one is changing or updating the data that is passed. Third one is specify the default value for all the components. And fourth one is used to manage the state globally. So these are some of the few applications of use context hook. The steps involved in using the use context hooks are: first you have to create a context which hold the data that is to be accessed or that is to be passed from one component to another component. So first we have to call this create context method. This will initialize the context. Here is an example. We'll create a simple context called student context to share the data or to access the student data in any component. So we have given the name here as student context. Then what we have done here is we have created a student object in a using use state hook. Student and set students are the method to update the data. In a use state, we have assigned the data like name is equal to dash, age is 40 and standard is 7. So to share this data or to allow the data to be accessed by any other component, that context need to be shared for using this context. So what we have to do is we simply have to use the student context that is created, and you have to call the provider, and you have to use this attribute value, and in front of you can specify your object. So in between use student data and student context, in between the student context and student context dot provider, you can call any other uh, component that share the data. Here we have called this use student data component, and here is the sample code that is to be write in use data component. So inside this use data component, we first have to use the context. To use the context, we have to use this use context hook, and you have to specify the name of your context that is created in first component. And to access the data, we can directly access the data using this use stud variable. So name is stud.name and age and standard. In this way we can access the data. So let us understand with by practical example how can we create this student context class. So the basic application is created, and you can see here there is nothing is written in app.cs. So first we'll create one component. For creating component, I'm going to create a component folder inside the source folder in my application. So I'm giving the name of the folder as components, and inside this component folder, NEMTS, inside this component folder, I'm going to create one student data context.js. Student data.js is a file. This is the component that I'm going to create, and inside this student data React.js. First, I will create a React function based component. For creating a React function based component, I am using the ES7 module. So this allows us to create a React function based component here. So I'm going to create the student context globally. So for that, I'm going to create one constant variable and giving the name as student context, in which we want to store the data that is to be shared among different components. So first, we have to import the create context hook, create context library. To import the create context library, what we can do is, so here inside this we can call create context, and here simply we have to call create context. So this will create a context in which the data can be stored and that can be accessed in any other component. It is actually a state. Once we maintain the state, that state can be processed by any other component. So after that what we can do is, we'll create an use state hook for storing the data into the student context. So first we'll create an student object. Create a student object, I'm using here stud, and to change the student object I'm using the setStud method, and here in front of that I'm using the use state hook. And first you have to import this use state hook. To use import this, I'm writing here use state. Then I can pass the data like this. I'm specifying the name as suppose Darsh Somoshi. Then age as around 40. Then class as standard. Instead of using class, I'm using standard as 7th. So this is the data that I have added into this student state. So this is the data. We can write this like this. So name, age and standard is the data that I have added in this state. Now what we can do here is to share this data in another component. So we have to use here student context. We have to use here student context dot provider, then value is equal to stud, and then we are going to end it. Inside this student context dot provider and end student context dot provider, I can call one more component in which I want to access this student data. So I'm going to create one component here. So for creating a component, I can write, again I'm writing here React function based component, and this is already imported. I'm going to delete it, and there should be one default function in an file. So I'm going to delete this export default, and I'm writing here use student data. Use student data is what the component. This is a student data component and this is use student data component. Here I'm going to use this data. So I have to call this use student data inside this. So to call this, I'm writing here use student data. So this component I have called, and inside this component I can directly use the data of student. First we need to access the context. For accessing the context, we have to use here use state context. Use context. Use context is an hook that we have to import. So using this use context hook, we can access the data. For accessing the data, I'm going to use here stud1 is equal to use context, and inside that we need to specify the context that is created for sharing the data. So this is the context for sharing the student data. So I'm specifying here student context. So whatever the data is there in student object, we can access the data using the student context and using this variable. So to print this data, so I'm going to write here This student data in student component I'm going to write. So here I'm going to print the data. To print the data I'm going to use here stud name. Name is equal to then stud1 dot name. I'm using the name here. Similar to that, to use the age I'm using the stud dot age and giving the message as age. And to use the class I can use like this stud1 dot class standard, stud1 dot standard, and here I'm specifying that ASTAN stand DAR standard, right? So this is the hook that we have created. This is the component that we have created which access the data which is available in this student object. With the help of this create context API, we have created a student context and we have added the student data inside it. So this is the method to add the data inside this context. To use that data in another component, whenever we want to use the data in another component, this is the syntax for providing the data. So in case of props, we provide props from one component to another component, but here once we add the data in context, the data can be easily accessed in another component. So here we have added the data into this context. So this is the statement or attribute that is to be used for providing the data or storing the data. And once we store the data, we will able to access the student context. And once we access the student context, we can access the student data. Now what we'll do is we'll use this student data component inside this app.js file. So here I have moved over the app.js file and I'm writing here student data student data. So this component that we have added. Now we'll compile it and we'll check what is the output. So output of this program is displayed like this. The student data in student component, and we are accessing that data in use student data component. So in this way, so this is what the first component called student data. Inside that we have added the student data. We can change the data whenever required, and whatever the data that is changed, this data will be able to access inside this use student data component. Means one component is creating some data, adding some data into context, and another component is getting data from context with the help of use context hook. So that is the uh, benefit of using use context. Without passing the data with props from component to component, we can access the data anywhere required in any component once we store the data in context. So I hope you understand what is the use of use context class. Thank you.